If you are an APOE4 carrier doing intermittent fasting wrong, you might actually be making your Alzheimer's risk worse and not better. Hi, I'm Dr. Kevin Tran. I'm a doctor of pharmacy and I'm an APOE4, which means I carry 2 copies of the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And for the past few months, I've been testing fasting protocols on myself while diving deep into the research. I actually watched so many people decline at the hospital when I was working in the geriatric unit in Paris, and I am determined to not follow the same path. Here's what I learned. Fasting can be super powerful for APOE4 carriers, but only if you get 3 things right, because our brains are different. APOE4 brains have a glucose metabolism problem that starts decades before symptoms actually appear, and fasting might be one of the most accessible tools we have to work around that problem. But here's the catch. The wrong fasting protocol can spike cortisol, worsen inflammation, and potentially accelerate the exact neurodegeneration we are trying to prevent. So if you are doing 16-8 or 18-6 or 1 meal a day or multi-day fasts, this video will help you figure out if you are in the sweet spot or if you need to adjust. Here's what we're covering today. First, why APOE4 brains respond differently to fasting, basically the glucose deficit and the ketone advantage. Second, we'll cover the science of time-restricted eating, what the 2023 Cell Metabolism study showed about reversing Alzheimer's pathology in mice. And third, we're looking at sex differences because those are critical. Women with APOE4 respond differently than men, especially regarding cortisol and stress. This is, by the way, why I always say there's no one-size-fits-all answer. And fourth, the optimal fasting windows. Is it 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours, 18 hours? What does the data actually say? And finally, when fasting backfires, the 5 situations where fasting can do more harm than good. Let's dive in. Let's start with a small confession. When I first found out I was an APOE4, I went super hard on intermittent fasting. I was actually doing 18-6 and sometimes 1 meal a day. And I thought more fasting would mean more autophagy, which means more protection. I would even go on 3 days fast, also water fast, where I only drink water to hope to get a lot of benefits. But after a few months, something felt very off. My sleep quality tanked, my HRV that I track with my Oura Ring dropped, and my cortisol, which I was tracking through quarterly blood work, was creeping up. So I started digging into the research and I realized I was making a very classic mistake, assuming that what works for APOE3 carriers, which a lot of studies on fasting are actually covering the general population, while thinking that APOE4 carriers and APOE4 brains are the same, meaning that whatever works for APOE4 carriers would automatically work for us. And that was a big mistake because it doesn't. APOE4 brains have a fundamentally different energy metabolism, and that changes everything about how we should approach fasting. So let's talk about what makes our brains different first. So if you carry APOE4, your brain has a glucose problem. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Neuroscience by Wu and colleagues found that APOE4 expressing cells show significantly impaired glucose utilization compared to APOE3. Specifically, they found reduced expression of glucose transporters and glycolytic enzymes. And to quote directly the paper, the APOE4 brain bears the most deficient profile in glucose utilization. And this isn't happening when you are 70 or older, right? This glucose hypometabolism starts in your 30s and 40s, which is decades before any cognitive symptoms. Your brain cells are essentially energy starved. They are trying to run on glucose, but the fuel delivery system is broken. So now here's where it gets very interesting. The same study found that APOE4 brains show superior ketone metabolism compared to APOE3. When they tested beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a primary ketone body, APOE4 cells showed 25% higher maximal respiration compared to APOE3 cells. The statistical significance is P equals 0.026. So we have this paradox. We can't use glucose efficiently, but we're really good at using ketones, which is great news. So the researchers suggest this robust ketone metabolism might be a compensatory response, basically our brains adapting to the glucose deficit. And this is why fasting becomes so interesting for us, or taking exogenous ketones, for example. So you have to know that fasting triggers a metabolic switch. After around 12 to 16 hours without food, your liver starts producing ketones very naturally. And those ketones become an alternative fuel source for your brain. For APOE4 carriers, this isn't just about weight loss or longevity, which are usually two other cases where people would fast. For us, it's about giving our brains the fuel they can actually use efficiently. But, and this is very important, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Okay, so we know APOE4 brains prefer ketones, but does fasting actually protect against Alzheimer's? Well, the most compelling evidence came out in 2023 in Cell Metabolism journal. Researchers at UC San Diego took two different Alzheimer's disease mouse models and put them on time-restricted feeding. Now, these mice didn't have APOE4 specifically, but they had aggressive Alzheimer's pathology, which is amyloid plaques, tau tangles, memory deficits, you name it, the whole package. The intervention was super simple. You restrict the eating window, no calories reduction, just when the mouse ate. And the results were remarkable. First, the amyloid plaques, which is the hallmark of Alzheimer's, were substantially reduced. The researchers saw decreased soluble and insoluble A-beta-40 and A-beta-42 in brain tissue. Second, tau pathology improved, so less hyperphosphorylated tau, which is the protein that forms tangles in Alzheimer's brains. Third, their memory improved, so the mice performed better on novel object recognition and spatial memory tasks. And this is, when they run in a maze and they try to remember like the route to find the cheese at the end of the maze. But here's what really caught my attention: circadian gene expression. The researchers found that Alzheimer's disease disrupts the rhythmic expression of clock genes, which are the genes that regulate your 24-hour biological rhythms, and time-restricted feeding normalized those patterns. So the quote from the paper is that TRF had the remarkable capability of simultaneously reducing amyloid deposition, increasing A-beta-42 clearance, improving sleep and memory, and normalizing daily transcription pattern of multiple genes, including those associated with AD and neuroinflammation. That's 5 different mechanisms hitting at once. Now you might be thinking, all right, Kevin, that's nice. It's very far to compare between a mice and a human, especially when you think about the fact that a mice can't survive if they don't eat for more than 3 days. And that's a very fair question. To use those mice models and compare them to humans, those are usually the limitations that you see in those papers. So the first thing you have to know is human trials are very limited. It's actually quite hard to recruit people at a large scale to try and have them fast for a longer period of time. But there is a 2019 case study of a 71-year-old woman with mild Alzheimer's who was APOE4, and she did a 10-week protocol, ketogenic diet plus time-restricted eating plus exercise, and her Montreal Cognitive Assessment score went from 21 out of 30 to 28 out of 30. That's a dramatic improvement. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's an N equal 1. It's one person. It's a case study. You can't generalize it. But it's kind of a proof of concept that this can work in humans. And we are also seeing so many different cases among like Phoenix community members where fasting has dramatically improved their cognition. And in fact, for myself, I feel like I work way better when I fast for a longer period of time. The authors of that paper actually note that the time-restricted eating component may have been critical for restoring metabolic flexibility and insulin sensitivity. So if you think about that, the whole mechanism makes sense, right? Mouse data is strong, early human data is promising, but here is where it gets a little bit complicated, is that you have differences depending on if you're a man or a woman. So if you're a woman with APOE4, you have to pay super attention here. This section might save you from making a very costly mistake, because the research shows that women and men respond very, very differently to fasting, and the differences matter more if you have APOE4. Let's start with cortisol. A 2019 study in mice found that fasting increases cortisol production, but the increase is twice as strong in females compared to males. Specifically, they found that fasting induced increases in FGF21, which is a hormone that regulates metabolism, were biased towards female. An 18-fold increase in female versus an 8-fold increase in males. Now, FGF21 is generally beneficial, but chronic elevation can signal metabolic stress. And here's why this matters for APOE4 carriers. We are already predisposed to inflammation. That's why when you're taking supplements and in all the guides we're publishing, we advise you to take a lot of supplements that reduce inflammation. And the problem is APOE4 reduces protection against neuroinflammation. So if you add fasting stress on top of baseline APOE4 inflammation, you might actually push yourself into a chronic stress state, especially if you're perimenopausal or postmenopausal, when estrogen's protective effects are actually reduced. So a systematic review found that women's bodies are more sensitive to the cortisol effects of fasting. Women may experience up to 50% increase in cortisol and less insulin sensitivity when fasting compared to men. And elevated cortisol isn't just uncomfortable, it can impair memory consolidation, disrupt sleep, and increase neuroinflammation. Remember that cortisol is the stress hormone after all. Now, does this mean women shouldn't fast? No, but it means that women need to be a bit more careful about. One, the fasting window's length, maybe 14 hours instead of 16 or 18. There's no reason to push it too far away because then your cortisol climbs up a lot. Two, be very careful about your stress management. If you're chronically stressed, fasting might be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? Because you already have a high baseline of cortisol. So try to add on meditation, journaling, or any other interventions that can reduce stress so you can actually fast and not have this huge spike in cortisol. And three, your hormonal status. Perimenopausal and postmenopausal women may need gentler protocols compared to men. So there's also APOE4 specific sex data. In the 2022 study in International Journal of Molecular Sciences, found that male APOE4 mice on a high-fat diet showed significant increases in brain IL-1 beta, which is an inflammatory marker, but female APOE4 mice didn't. However, females showed exaggerated glucose intolerance. So female APOE4 carriers may have more metabolic dysfunction than males in response to dietary challenges, even without the same inflammatory markers. So the takeaway is that sex matters a lot. So don't just randomly trust a clinical trial when they group people together, because then doing an average out of the male and the female might create so much noise that you wouldn't be able to detect the differences, and they exist. So if you are a woman with APOE4, and especially if you're over 50 years old, you need to monitor how fasting affects your stress level, your sleep quality, and your energy. Don't just copy what works for men. All right, so here's a question everyone wants answered since the beginning of this video. How long should you fast? Let's look at the data. A pooled analysis of time-restricted eating studies found that the 12-hour eating window, meaning a 12-hour fast, did not yield significant health benefits. The 10-hour eating windows, which means a 14 hours fast, showed improvement. So in patients with metabolic syndrome, 14 hours fasting for 12 weeks reduced weight, blood pressure, and atherogenic lipids. So this is where it starts getting interesting, right? Because you can start eating your first meal at, let's say, 10 and finish your last meal at 8 p.m., which is completely okay when you think about it. Now, the 8-hour eating windows, which is the 16-hour fast, which is the one that most people find quite comfortable to do, showed the most consistent benefits across studies. So you have weight loss, improved glucose regulation, decreased blood pressure, and improved cholesterol. And this means skipping your breakfast, having your first meal starting at 12 noon, and then ending your last meal at 8 p.m. The thing is, there's something that can bring a bit of concern. A 2024 analysis of over 20,000 US adults found that people who limited eating to less than 8 hours per day had a 91% higher risk of cardiovascular death compared to those eating across 12 to 16 hours. 91% higher risk. That's insane. It's massive. Now, this was just observational data, so it's very hard to prove causation. Many people doing very restrictive fasting had underlying health issues, but it's kind of a red flag. Because it's observational data, you could derive a lot of reasons from that. Maybe the people who skipped breakfast were coming from a social background where they had to work very early and they were very exhausted, or they had more stressful jobs. It's very difficult to derive causation from that, but we should really look into this. The expert consensus is that health researchers say that for most people, a fast of 12 to 14 hours is a pretty safe bet. So the Goldilocks zone appears to be 14 to 16 hours of fasting, long enough to trigger metabolic switching and ketone production, but not so long that you spike cortisol or increase cardiovascular risk. Now, what is interesting is you can add a last variable, which is when you eat. Early time-restricted eating, so meaning you have your first meal earlier and your last meal finishing at around 6 or 7 p.m., actually appears to be more beneficial than late time-restricted eating, where you skip breakfast and eat late. Why? Because it aligns with your natural circadian rhythm, and cortisol is naturally lower in the evening. So fasting overnight into mid-morning doesn't add that much additional stress. And if you want to maximize your sleep, usually the advice is to finish your meal 3 to 4 hours before you get to bed. So late night eatings might disrupt your melatonin and growth hormone secretion, which happen during sleep. So if you're trying to maximize that and optimize as much as you can, aim for a 14 to 16 hours fast, finish your last meal by 7 p.m. and break your fast around 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning. For APOE4 carriers, I'd definitely start with 14 hours and see how you feel. If your sleep quality improves, energy is stable, and you don't feel wired and tired, you can experiment with 16. But if you're feeling stressed, sleep deprived, or noticing increased anxiety, just pull back slightly. Okay, so fasting is incredibly powerful, but I want you to know it's not a universal good. There are 5 situations where fasting can do more harm than good, especially for APOE4 carriers. The red flag number 1 is chronic stress. We mentioned that earlier. If you're already under chronic stress, whether that is at work, with relationships, caregiving, or financial stress, adding fasting stress on top of that can push you into a chronic cortisol elevation state. And remember, fasting is hormetic stress. It's good stress in the right dose, but if your stress bucket is already full, fasting overflows it. Red flag number 2 is poor sleep quality. If you're sleeping less than 7 hours every night, or if your sleep quality is poor, fasting will make it way worse, because fasting increases cortisol and adrenaline, which are wake-promoting hormones, which means that if you wake up in the middle of the night, you'll have more troubles falling asleep. And if you don't manage to keep a longer period of time asleep, then this will worsen it. And I really advise you to wear any type of wearables to be able to track your sleep. I have a Oura Ring, I have a Garmin watch. Any of those would work, like Whoop, for example, as well. So fix your sleep first before adding fasting. Red flag number 3 is if you are perimenopause or menopause. So if you're a woman, if you are going through hormonal transitions, your baseline cortisol is already elevated due to declining estrogen. You can really consider hormonal replacement with your doctor, but adding fasting stress can actually worsen any hot flashes that you have, mood swings, or sleep disruption. So consider gentler protocols, 12 to 14 hours max, or cycle fasting with your menstrual cycle if you are still cycling. Red flag number 4 is diabetes and blood sugar issues. If you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, fasting requires careful glucose monitoring and medical supervision, because hypoglycemia risk is really real, and the stress response to low blood sugar can be inflammatory. So once again, work with your doctor. Don't go crazy on your own if you have type 1 or type 2 diabetes. And lastly, red flag number 5 is if you have a history of eating disorders. Fasting can trigger disordered eating patterns in people with a history of anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder. If this is you, fasting might not be worth the psychological risk. There are other ways to enhance autophagy and support brain health. You can think about exercise, sleep, sauna, cold exposure. We'll cover all of these in future videos. Bottom line is, fasting is a tool. It works beautifully for some people. For others, it backfires. And think about your own preferences too, right? If it's a nightmare for you because you're constantly hungry, then just don't do it. Listen to your body, track your blood, track your biomarkers, monitor your sleep quality and HRV. And if fasting makes you feel worse and not better, just stop and see if those biomarkers become better right after. Then you'll know fasting is the culprit. All right, let's recap this video. APOE4 brains have a glucose metabolism problem and a ketone metabolism advantage. Fasting helps us access ketones as an alternative fuel. We'll do another video on keto diet, which will dramatically increase your ketone production. But for now, time-restricted eating, specifically 14 to 16 hours, shows the strongest evidence for metabolic benefits and may reduce Alzheimer's pathology based on animal studies. Remember that sex differences matter. Women are more sensitive to fasting-induced cortisol elevation, especially during hormonal transition. The Goldilocks zone is 14 to 16 hours. Less than 12 doesn't do much, so it doesn't mean anything. More than 18 increases cardiovascular risk. And fasting backfires if you're chronically stressed, sleep deprived, perimenopausal, diabetic, or if you have a history of eating disorders. So if you're curious about my personal protocol, I try to do 16 most days. I finish eating by 7 p.m. I try to skip breakfast, or I have a very light protein shake and then go exercise. And I track my fasting in the Phoenix app along with my blood work. So I can see if my fasting window correlates with improvement in my ApoB, my fasting glucose, and in my inflammatory markers. It's very important to track all of these daily, and that's why we have in our app this daily journal where we can basically choose regarding our sleep, our stress levels, and have a place where we can journal everything that's happening on a day-to-day basis. And that systematic approach, testing, tracking, adjusting, is how you figure out what works for you. Speaking of tracking, if you're an APOE4 carrier who wants to systematically optimize your protocols, that's exactly what I built the Phoenix community for. Inside Phoenix, you can track your blood work over time with APOE4 specific target ranges, so you know if your ApoB of 70 is good for APOE4 carriers or not. You can run self-experiments like testing different fasting windows and link them to your biomarkers to see what actually moves the needle. You get matched into accountability pods of a few APOE4 carriers with similar health goals, so you're not optimizing alone, and you get early access to clinical trials and access to studies. We actually just finished a study with a red light therapy device, and the results are coming in end of January, February. If you're curious, the link is in the description. If you join, I will see you inside. If this video helped you understand fasting and APOE4, please hit the like button so more people can find it, and that's how you support this channel and you support me. And if you want more APOE4 specific protocols on exercise, supplements, sleep, vascular health, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm putting out new deep dives like these at least once every week. Remember, your mother's fate doesn't have to be yours. You're not powerless. You are just getting started. I'm Dr. Kevin Tran. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.